Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to talk about the effects on the Cold War on the quote unquote Third World. So we'll talk about how countries that were not necessarily either associated or closely allied with the United States or associated and closely allied with the Soviet Union, how this global struggle between the two superpowers affected them and how they struggled to navigate the distance between these two global geopolitical giants. So here's our objectives. Let's dive in. During the Cold War, we got this three worlds theory. Basically, the first world is the United States and its allies. The second world is the Soviet Union and their allies. The third world is neutral and non-aligned countries. And so, to some extent, this fed into our basic sense that the first world and the second world were competing against each other for control and associations and influence over the quote-unquote third world. So that's where we get this whole three worlds philosophy and the whole third world country thing. So one of the countries not associated with these that was part of this third world is Egypt. We'll spend some time talking about Egypt in its relation to Israel later, and so we're going to skip over that, but just know that Egypt is an important Arab nation. We've talked about their modernization plans and their separation from the Ottoman Empire. We've talked about Egypt a bunch of different times. At this point, Egypt is ruled by a secular dictator who's trying to both be a leader in the Muslim Arab world and also sort of keep themselves out to some extent, / use the conflict between the US and the Soviets in order to benefit himself and the Egyptian people. So keep in mind, we'll spend more time talking about Egypt's invasion of Israel and the Arab-Israeli wars, but we're just going to skirt over that for now. The guy you need to know as far as the modern dictator of Egypt is Gamal Nasser. Nasser is going to push a platform of secular modernization. We're going to see this throughout a lot of the Arab Muslim world, is these secular military dictators coming to power, pushing education, pushing technology, pushing economic modernization, and really allowing women to have significant rights and freedoms that they didn't have under Sharia law. And so we see this secularization of Egypt during this time period, and Nasser being kind of the image of that model of Arab Muslim development. The Suez Crisis is one example where Nasser was able to use the power of the Soviet Union and the United States against each other. So we're not going to watch this video here. I'm just going to briefly explain the crisis, and then we'll see the effects of all of this. Here is Nasser's explanation of why he needed to sue, what happened when he tried to take control of the Suez Canal, which, as you hopefully remember, is the waterway connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea that had been mostly under British control since back in the day of Muhammad Ali. In the Suez Crisis, Nasser seized control of the canal. British, French, and Israeli troops then invaded and grabbed the canal back. Nasser opened up talks with the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in order to get Soviet support. And in order to prevent growing Soviet influence in Egypt, the United States forced England, France, and Israel to back down and withdraw their troops. So Nasser is able to effectively use the ability to play the Soviets and the Americans off each other in order to gain control of the Suez Canal. He does similar things in creating the Aswan Dam, and so that's one mode of keeping the United States and the Soviet Union out of your country. In India, India was still a colony of England during this time period and in the post-war years. And what we ended up seeing is India not being treated super great during World War II. The Bengali famine was a spectacular famine in Bengal that was caused mostly by British mismanagement and the fear that any resources sent to India might fall into Japanese hands. And so England more or less let the Bengali famine happen, which put significant pressure on England to limit their influence in India going forward, because this is an example of just horrific colonial mismanagement. After the war, India gets its independence from England. And so India is now going to become an independent country, but there's still a whole bunch of questions as far as British India goes, because India, as you hopefully remember, was not an independent polity before the British invaded. It was a whole bunch of different ethnic and religious groups, tons of different languages, tons of different cultural groups, tons of different areas before this. And so even British India was a hodgepodge of different economic and political entities that are sort of overlapping each other. So what is this independent India going to look like? Is it going to control all the territory that the British ostensibly governed? To what extent is it going to represent the various languages, religions, and ethnic groups of the various places in India? What about the Adivasi and some of the other sort of groups that are sort of on the outskirts of Indian society, stuff like that. So, in the aftermath of this, it is decided that India is going to be partitioned into two countries: the predominantly Hindu India and the predominantly Muslim Pakistan. Both East and West Pakistan are going to be part of originally the same country, although eventually East Pakistan is going to become Bangladesh because governing, non-contiguous territories is really, really problematic. And so there is this partition of India with this divided and contested Kashmir region up in the mountains in between the two. Unfortunately, the movement of people to these areas created a massive humanitarian crisis. So take a moment, read, and we'll move forward. In the end, this partition and huge movement of people led to, again, as we said, humanitarian crisis and untold numbers of death. And so this is always an example that is used when you talk about, why don't we just divide people up and move them around? Well, it turns out that's incredibly difficult to actually do in practice. And if it's botched, it can lead to horrific atrocities and the deaths of potentially hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And the partition of India and Pakistan did lead to the deaths of untold numbers of people. I think to this day, even the actual death toll of the partition and human movement between India and Pakistan is not fully agreed upon. The leader of post-independence India is Nehru, and he is going to be one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement, and he's also going to work hard to create Indian identity. His political party, the Indian National Congress, is going to be the ruling party, the sole party in control of India. It's still an important political party in India today, although their influence has waned, and we're definitely going to come back and talk about the Indian National Congress and why and how they fell from power. Here he is laying out his pattern of non-alignment. So take a moment, pause, and read. And so India is going to take a middle path under Nehru. They're going to, in some ways, adopt some portions of Soviet development. They're going to push 5-year plans, things like that. But at the same time, they're still going to adopt democracy. They're still going to have press freedoms and openness. They're not going to adopt the type of repressive society that the Soviet Union has. And they're going to be one of the leaders of what's called the non-aligned movement. A number of nations, as you can see here, Nasser's Egypt is one of them, that are going to try to take a middle path and not choose sides between the Soviet Union and the United States, partially for economic reasons, partially for political reasons, partially for, not wanting to be caught up in proxy wars and military regions. And so the non-aligned movement is going to include all these different countries. In Iran, there's a huge battle between the United States and the Soviet Union for control over Iran. Iran was occupied, at least the northern parts, by the Soviets in the later days of World War II. And in the end, the only way that the United States was able to secure Soviet withdrawal is through the threat of nuclear weapons. Truman threatened war with the Soviet Union unless they withdrew their troops, and so that occurred. As you hopefully remember, Iran had been previously fought over by the Russians and the British, and so this idea of different Western powers sort of trying to take control over Iran was a long-standing one. In the end, in the 1950s, a politician named Mohammad Mossadegh came to power. He was a leftist politician who argued that they should nationalize Iranian oil reserves, many of which were under the control of the British company, British Petroleum. He also pushed sort of a secular, sort of a leftist version of Iranian society. And so he was opposed by some of the hardline religious elements who wanted Islam to play a larger role in Iranian daily life. And so he's going to come to power and he is going to push for nationalization, but he's going to be overthrown by a combination of English and American backed forces and Iranian religious forces. These two groups together are going to force Mossadegh from power, and he is going to resign and flee. And the guy who's going to rise to replace him is the Shah, Reza Pahlavi. He is going to follow mostly American and British interests, sort of continuing the path of allowing Iranian oil resources to be developed by foreign companies. But he's also going to push the Nasser path of sort of secular modernization. And we'll spend some time talking. The White Revolution in Iran was a similar revolution to what we saw with Nasser, in that you're going to economically modernize, you're going to bring in elements of capitalism, you're going to greatly expand the role of women. And this is going to create some advantages in Iranian society, but it's also going to outrage conservative Iranian religious figures, the Ayatollahs and the clerics, who want a more strict interpretation of Islam. And so, although the overthrow of Mossadegh did appease some Western interests and did provide a higher quality of life for a lot of Iranians, the religious-backed figures who helped support Mossadegh's overthrow were mostly disappointed. And we're going to see that tension continue to grow in Iran, with people who want that sort of conservative version of Islam implemented feeling increasingly frustrated. The Shah is also going to be famous for his crackdowns, and specifically his use of the Savak, his brutal secret police forces. This was incredibly problematic and created a lot of resentment amongst liberal Iranians against the Shah's policies. And they're going to advocate for more democracy, more freedom of speech, more access to information, and more ability to participate in politics. And so we see sort of this liberal bourgeoisie rising up in Iran, sort of demanding these sort of political reforms that we've seen in Europe back during the French Revolution and the aftermath. And so again, we see some of the same forces coming in here. Reforms happen, and this bourgeoisie now is going to want greater access and greater rights. So that brings us to the end of the effect of the Cold War on the Third World. There's a couple different models here to look at, and keep in mind, we're going to be returning to a lot of these places to go into more detail on, for example, the Arab-Israeli conflicts in future lessons, and really returning to Iran to look at these rising tensions and how all of that built into the Iranian Revolution. But for right now, thank you for listening.